Leaving didn't feel like freedom. It felt like exposure. Once the decision settled into something real, the adrenaline faded and left behind a quieter, heavier emotion: vulnerability. I had built my life around systems that buffered impact, softened consequences, absorbed risk. Walking away meant facing the world without those buffers. Every interaction felt sharper, more honest, more dangerous. The first losses were practical. Access disappeared. Opportunities that once felt abundant evaporated without explanation. Messages went unanswered. Familiar names stopped appearing on my screen. I had known this would happen, yet each absence still landed like a small confirmation of how conditional my place had been. I tried not to take it personally. That was harder than I expected. Financial uncertainty arrived quickly. Not desperation, but instability. The kind that forces you to think several steps ahead, to calculate choices you once made instinctively. I downsized my life quietly. Fewer outings, less indulgence. I told myself this was temporary, but the adjustment felt symbolic. A shedding of excess that had once disguised dependency. Emotionally, the silence was overwhelming. Without constant stimulation, without expectations pulling at me from every direction, my thoughts grew louder. Memories surfaced uninvited. Conversations replayed themselves in my mind with new clarity. Things I had brushed past now demanded attention. I saw how often I had compromised without acknowledging it, how I had mistaken endurance for strength, how easily I had allowed my boundaries to become negotiable. The guilt surprised me. Not guilt for leaving, but for staying as long as I did, for participating in dynamics that eroded my sense of self, for justifying choices that no longer aligned with who I wanted to be. I wrestled with shame, with regret, with the fear that damage had already been done. I forced myself not to rush toward redemption. I knew better now than to replace one performance with another. The urge to explain myself followed me everywhere. To friends, to acquaintances, to people who noticed my sudden disappearance from certain circles. I resisted it. I learned to say less, to allow ambiguity. I didn't owe anyone a narrative neat enough to make them comfortable. Some people drifted away quietly. Others reappeared cautiously, unsure of how to engage with this newer, less predictable version of me. A few surprised me with their steadiness. Their presence felt grounding, not demanding. I clung to that. There were moments when fear surged unexpectedly, when I questioned whether I had made a mistake, whether the security I abandoned, however conditional, had been preferable to this uncertainty. Those moments were often triggered by exhaustion, by loneliness, by the sheer effort of rebuilding without shortcuts. I reminded myself why I left. Not because it was easy, not because it was noble, but because staying had become unbearable. I began therapy during this time, though I avoided calling it that at first. I told myself I was just talking things through, getting perspective. In reality, I needed help untangling the ways my autonomy had been reshaped, naming patterns, reclaiming instincts I no longer trusted. The process was slow, painfully slow. I learned that healing doesn't announce progress with dramatic breakthroughs. It shows up quietly, in moments of restraint, in decisions made without fear, in the ability to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it. I started rebuilding my life with intention rather than momentum, choosing environments that felt honest, even if they were less exciting, relationships that allowed for inconsistency without punishment, work that didn't require performance as a prerequisite for worth. Some days I missed the intensity. I missed feeling desired, central, powerful in the way that only volatility can make you feel. I acknowledged that longing without judgment. It didn't mean I wanted to return, it meant I was human. The escort-adjacent chapters of my past lingered in unexpected ways, not as temptation, but as memory. as a reminder of how easily circumstances can push you toward choices you once thought unimaginable. I faced those memories carefully, without romanticizing them, without condemning myself for surviving the way I did. I understood now that survival often comes dressed as compromise. Leaving had stripped my life down to its essentials. It forced me to confront myself without distraction, without performance, without the illusion of control. That confrontation was uncomfortable, but it was honest. For the first time in years, my future felt uncertain in a way that wasn't dictated by someone else's expectations. That uncertainty scared me. It also felt like possibility. Acceptance didn't arrive as relief. It arrived as fatigue, a deep, bone-level tiredness that stripped away the urge to fight reality. I stopped trying to frame my past in ways that made it easier to live with. I stopped asking whether things could have ended differently. I began to see that those questions were just another form of control, an attempt to rewrite what had already shaped me. Loss became something I carried instead of something I resisted. I lost people I thought would stay. I lost access I once believed defined my value. I lost the illusion that intelligence alone could protect me from manipulation. Each loss hurt in a different way, but together they created space. Space where nothing was demanded of me. Space where silence wasn't punishment. That silence was unfamiliar at first. I didn't know how to exist without constant expectation, without needing to anticipate reactions, without calibrating myself to fit the emotional temperature of a room. I felt awkward, exposed, unsure of how to move through conversations that weren't transactional. But slowly, something shifted. I began to notice how my body responded differently to this quieter life. My shoulders relaxed without me forcing them to. My breathing deepened. I slept through the night more often than not. The vigilance that had once felt permanent started to loosen its grip. I learned to tolerate stillness. That was harder than enduring chaos had ever been. There were days when doubt returned sharply, when I wondered if I had exaggerated the harm, if I had abandoned something salvageable. Those thoughts usually arrived when I felt lonely, when progress felt invisible. I learned to recognize them for what they were, echoes of a dynamic that rewarded endurance over well-being. I stopped arguing with those thoughts. I let them pass. Rebuilding trust with myself took time. I had to relearn how to listen to my instincts without immediately questioning them, how to say no without apology, how to allow myself to want things that didn't come with leverage or consequence. I made mistakes, small ones, human ones. I overcommitted sometimes. I withdrew too much at others. But each mistake felt recoverable, not catastrophic. That distinction mattered more than I expected. I reconnected with parts of myself that had gone quiet for years. Creativity returned slowly, humor too, not the sharp performative wit I once used as armor, but something gentler, more honest. I found comfort in routines that didn't impress anyone, in work that felt grounding rather than consuming. The past didn't disappear, it integrated. I stopped seeing those years as a failure and began to understand them as a period of adaptation under pressure. I didn't excuse the harm to myself or others, but I acknowledged the context that shaped my decisions. Compassion replaced condemnation, and with it came a kind of peace I hadn't known before. The relationship that once dominated my life became smaller in my memory, less vivid, less central, not because it hadn't mattered, but because it no longer defined me. I could think about it without my body reacting, as if danger were imminent. That felt like freedom, not the dramatic kind, not the kind sold as empowerment, but the quiet freedom of alignment, of no longer living at odds with myself, of making choices that didn't require justification. I understood now that healing wasn't about returning to who I was before. That version of me didn't exist anymore. Healing was about becoming someone who could hold her past without being ruled by it. Someone who knew her boundaries not as walls, but as guides. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. What surprised me most about healing was how ordinary it felt once it began. Not cinematic, not transformative in a single moment. Just a slow accumulation of small choices that, over time, reshaped how I existed in the world. I stopped measuring my worth by intensity. That was the hardest habit to break. For so long, I had equated chaos with depth, volatility with passion, pressure with purpose. Calm felt suspicious. Stability felt dull. I had to unlearn the belief that suffering was evidence of meaning. Some days, I missed the version of myself who thrived in extremes. The woman who could walk into any room and immediately adapt, command attention, read the undercurrents before anyone else noticed them. That skill hadn't disappeared. It had simply been retired from constant use. I learned to see it as a tool, not an identity. As time passed, I became more honest with people around me, selectively, carefully. I didn't offer full confessions. I didn't narrate every detail of my past. I shared what felt necessary, what felt true, and nothing more. To my surprise, most people didn't demand explanations. They accepted the version of me that showed up without probing. That acceptance felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. I began noticing how differently I reacted to conflict. I no longer rushed to smooth things over. I allowed tension to exist without immediately absorbing responsibility for it. Discomfort became something I could tolerate rather than something I needed to eliminate. This changed my relationships fundamentally. Some connections deepened, others faded. I stopped chasing resolution with people who benefited from my over-accommodation. I let silence do its work. That silence, once terrifying, became informative. It showed me who respected my boundaries and who only tolerated them when convenient. I started trusting myself again, not blindly, but deliberately. I learned to pause before making decisions, to check in with my body instead of overriding it. I paid attention to the signals I used to ignore: fatigue, resistance, relief. They were data, not weaknesses. The escort-adjacent chapters of my life no longer felt like secrets I needed to protect or wounds I needed to display. They became context. Part of the terrain I had crossed, not the destination that defined me. I spoke about them internally without shame, without pride, just honesty. That neutrality was new. I noticed how much energy shame had consumed without me realizing it, how it had kept me tethered to the past long after I had left the circumstances behind. Letting go of shame didn't mean denying responsibility. It meant refusing to let my worst compromises dictate my future. There were moments when fear resurfaced unexpectedly, when a familiar dynamic appeared in a new form, when someone tested a boundary the way he once had. Those moments were clarifying rather than paralyzing. I recognized the pattern quickly. I trusted myself to respond, and I did. Sometimes that response was withdrawal, sometimes confrontation, sometimes simply saying no and moving on. Each time, the world didn't collapse. Nothing catastrophic followed. That realization recalibrated my sense of risk more than anything else. I began imagining a future that wasn't defined by reaction, a life built slowly, intentionally, without the need to perform resilience or desirability. The idea felt radical in its simplicity. Peace, I learned, is not the absence of struggle, it's the absence of self-betrayal. That understanding settled into me quietly, without ceremony. It didn't erase the past, it contextualized it. It allowed me to carry my experiences without being crushed by them. For the first time, I wasn't trying to become someone else. I was becoming myself again. Not the version I used to be, but the one who had survived becoming something else entirely, and that felt like truth. There's a strange moment that arrives when a story finally loosens its grip on you. Not because you've forgotten it, and not because it no longer matters, but because it no longer demands to be retold in order to be understood. That's where I am now. I don't feel the need to justify what happened anymore. I don't rehearse explanations in my head. I don't search for language that will make my past more acceptable or my choices easier to digest. The story exists. It shaped me. And it no longer owns me. What I learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, is that control rarely announces itself as control. It arrives disguised as opportunity, as attention, as belonging. It tells you that you are special, chosen, capable of handling what others can't. And if you're not careful, you start believing that enduring harm is proof of strength. It isn't. Strength isn't how much you can tolerate. It's how clearly you can see when something is costing you more than it's giving. It's how willing you are to walk away, even when staying feels safer in the short term. I wish someone had told me that earlier, but I also understand now that I might not have been ready to hear it. There are parts of my past that still ache when I think about them. Moments where I wish I had acted differently, spoken sooner, trusted myself more. I don't run from those thoughts anymore. I let them exist without letting them define me. Regret, when met with honesty, can become information rather than punishment. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself in my story, I want to be careful with what I say next. I'm not offering advice. I'm not prescribing solutions. Everyone's circumstances are different, and leaving isn't always immediate, simple, or safe. But I will say this. Pay attention to how your body reacts when your mind is trying to convince you that everything is fine. Notice the fatigue that doesn't go away, the tension that feels permanent, the moments when silence feels heavier than conflict. Those signals aren't weaknesses, they're intelligence. You don't need to hit rock bottom to choose yourself. You don't need permission to step back from a life that no longer fits. And you don't owe anyone a version of yourself that requires self-erasure to maintain. I used to believe that starting over meant erasing what came before. I know now that it means integrating it, carrying the lessons forward without dragging the weight of shame behind you, allowing complexity without romanticizing harm. My life is quieter now, smaller in some ways, but it's mine. I make decisions without scanning for approval. I form connections without calculating leverage. I allow myself to want things simply because they feel right, not because they prove something. That doesn't mean I'm fearless, it means I'm aligned. And alignment, I've learned, is the most sustainable form of freedom there is. This story doesn't end with triumph or closure in the way stories are often expected to. It ends with continuity, with a person still learning, still adjusting, still choosing herself in small, unremarkable ways. That's enough for me, because the life I'm building now doesn't need to be impressive. It just needs to be honest.